Cops of Reddit, what has so far been the creepiest call you've ever had to respond to and what happened? 911 dispatcher reporting in. Received a call from an elderly lady who had trouble breathing. I had taken several calls from her and her husband in the past, so I recognized her voice. I dispatched an ambulance to her residence and held her on the line, trying to keep her calm while the ambulance was responding. Ambulance advised that they are 15-minute ETA. She lived in a very rural part of WV. I'm talking to her, asking about her husband and how he was doing and just making small talk with her. The ambulance calls in and advises they are on scene, and I let them know that she is in severe respiratory distress, and I still had her on the line. I let her know the ambulance is coming to the door to go answer the door, and she says okay and hangs up the phone. Pretty normal, yeah? Well, here's where it gets weird. The EMT and paramedic on scene call back about a minute later and advises no one is answering the door. We have a sheriff unit who was in the area pulling on scene about that time. The sheriff unit confirmed the address and advised he is breaching the door to make access to the PT. 5 minutes go by and the paramedic on scene radios in asking who the caller was. I advise it was the elderly female who lived at the residence. He tells me that he's going to call in and needs to speak with the supervisor on shift. We get him over to the supervisor, and the supervisor confirms the information that I gave him and asks what's going on. Apparently the elderly female had been dead for a while and was already in full rigor mortis. They thought I was wrong on the caller, but the other dispatchers played it back and confirmed that it was the female who called. The ambulance transferred the hospital and we got the same calls and disbelief from the doctors. So, I took a call from a ghost. I am interning with a sheriff's police department, so most of my time is spent on patrol. We got called out to do a wellness check, which the deputy thought was going to be a piece of cake, like she was out of town or something. We get there and are met by the neighbors, who told us that the mail is piling up in the mailbox and that there are several untouched packages on the porch. Okay, so we go up the house and the front door is unsecured, so we crack open the door a couple of inches and the deputy calls inside, but the door won't move anymore. The house was one of those split houses where the stairs meet at the front door and the upstairs and downstairs are offset, so we concluded that there might be stuff behind the door. It's about this time that the deputy tells me that she is a known hoarder and that could be why the door was stuck. He also mentions that if we see flies on the inside of the windows, she is most likely inside and deceased. As we walk around the side of the house, we notice a lot of flies on the windows. The back door was locked, and as we looked in we noticed bags on bags of garbage, diapers and miscellaneous shit all over the place. We head back to the front and attempt to make entry. He pushes the door open, this time with more force, and from underneath I see a grease-like liquid spreading out from under the door. The deputy stops, closes the door and calmly tells me that the lady was indeed dead, and wedged behind the door. From the dates of the packages we concluded that she had been gone about 2 months. Once we did make entry into the house, I was allowed inside. After 2 months she didn't even look like a human corpse. Her skin and body had sagged and melted to the floor, and her face was all black and had been eaten to the bone by maggots. I'll never forget the smell when the coroners moved her and she popped. It was like a physical presence. Whatever those people get paid to deal with that shit, it's not enough. The thing that really got to me though, was wondering if she had fallen down the stairs and died there, or if she fell and was unable to move and waited for help that would never come. Went to a welfare check. A neighbor called in he hasn't seen this guy for a few days and the lights have been on for a while. I go and look around and find no footprints or tire marks in the snow, recent storm. I check the garage and nothing. I check the house, which was unlocked, and found the guy's cell phone, keys, wallet and cash with the TV on. That's when I realized this was now a dead body search. I looked everywhere in and outside the house and around the garage. There were several old junk vehicles on the property, but again, no tire marks or shoe prints or anything. I call all recent numbers on his phone and no one's heard from him. Only so much I can do, so I issue a ball and we start getting sick paperwork ready. Next day the day shift officer goes over to follow up. Turns out, the guy was plowing his driveway and either had a medical condition or something and either passed out or died on the spot and crashed the truck onto the other junk cars, which then caught on fire. Edit, investigation leads to the fact this happens a week before I got this call, leaving only a pile of bones in the front seat covered in snow. I felt like shit for not finding him that night, but it was really creepy knowing his remains were inches away from where I was searching. I'm not a cop, but my dad just recently shared these stories with me. My grandfather was a cop in a small town in the 60s, 70s. Late at night it was common for officers to pull over vehicles driving through town, especially if they didn't recognize them. He pulls over a busload of people. He walks through and asks them where they are headed, yada yada. They were headed to California. It was Charles Manson and his group. Another story. Same grandfather, same stop, a car passing through protocol. Asked the driver where he was headed, BSD for a while, and told the guy to have a nice evening. Few towns over, guy gets pulled over again, shoots and kills the cop. Apparently he was doing this as he drove along, get pulled over and shoot the cop. When they questioned him he said he had been pulled over by my grandfather, but he was such a nice guy he didn't kill him, but he did have the gun sitting in his lap. Went to the site of a suicide by firearm. The guy was DRT with 2 gunshots to the head. How, you ask? The first one didn't complete the job. You could see where he walked to the bathroom mirror, looked at the failed suicide attempt and then returned to the living room to finish the job. Not sure if that counts as creepy, but I've always wondered what was going through his head when he looked in the mirror. From a post I made a few weeks ago. I was called out to negotiate with a 17-year-old female who had barricaded herself in a bathroom with multiple knives and scissors. She done it right too. SWAT ended up going through the sheetrock wall. She wouldn't talk with me at all but had multiple graphic conversations with her mother, who committed suicide 3 years earlier, and her dad, who's serving lots of years in prison for sexually abusing her. When SWAT pulled her out she had completed multiple circumcisions on herself with the scissors, completely cut her nipples off, and had sodomized herself multiple times with multiple steak knives. The kicker was, she was talking the whole time and her tone or volume never changed. The pain never bothered her. Or, more likely, she never felt it. The human mind is scary as FCK. Not a cop but answering 911 lines. Had an open line of a guy yelping ow, in between thud noises. He didn't respond to anything I said. Turns out, those thuds were the sounds of him chopping off his fingers with a meat cleaver. Had a Good Samaritan call about a guy pulled up in front of a medical center in his car. He had a travel blender plugged into his vehicle and he was bleeding heavily. He had chopped his dick off and put it in the blender. I forget the specifics as to why, but it had something to do with the pending child molestation or rape case. Last but not least, the one that will stick with me, is the woman who called at around 8 in the morning on a Sunday telling me, in an eerily calm voice, that she had killed her baby by bashing his head into the floor because the devil was inside him. I didn't believe her. It was true. Edit, I didn't believe her as in, I didn't think she really harmed her children. I stopped a 25-year-old Asian male from entering the east executive entrance of the White House. He had slit his wrists and neck prior to his arrival, but not deep enough to hit major blood vessels. He told me that he was a secret agent working for J. Edgar Hoover and that he was 60 years old. He said he had important information to pass to President Obama. I ended up having to detain him, stop the bleeding and then involuntarily commit him. Turned out to be a local college kid, going through some mental health issues. I field interviewed hundreds of White House callers but this kid took the cake. Got a report of a missing husband. He told his wife and family of 6 children that he was going to get his tires changed, but never returned, and this was 12 hours ago. They had purchased another house in a neighboring community, and the relationship with the wife was under pressure, so the wife assumed he was staying at the other house, and claimed he would never kill himself. The strange thing about this report though was that he emptied his personal bank account into his wife's this morning as well. The wife explained this off, saying that they recently had a fight about finances, and he agreed that he was bad at money and maybe they should just have a joint account that she controls. On a hunch, I asked his 14-year-old boy if there were any areas in the mountains nearby that his father enjoyed going, and the son identified a road about 10 miles away. It was nearing midnight, but I decided to drive to the top of this old and abandoned Forest Service road. As I drove through the snow and started to climb the road, I felt a gut feeling that I would 100% find this guy up there either thinking about or already acted out a suicide. The snow-laid gravel road had some sign of travel, but no real indication of how fresh the vehicle tracks could be. As I reached the top of the road after an hour of travel, I was honestly surprised that I did not find his black truck. I spent the drive back down thinking about gut feelings and how they are unreliable, but that I somehow felt different about this one. As I traveled up the road, I did notice over a dozen smaller roads branching off, but they were not mapped, and I had already spent too much time on a single occurrence in a busy city with too few police officers. Nonetheless, I decided to check a single of these secondary roads, and about 3/4s of the way down I picked a road at random to check, and sure enough my headlights lit up the back end of a black truck about 100 yards past the first corner. Even if I hadn't memorized the license plate beforehand, I wouldn't have had to run it, it was clearly his. I radioed that I had found the truck, parked my vehicle, and traveled the 20 feet to his truck with my heart beating like I was doing it at a sprint rather than a normal walk. What I found inside was a mess of brains and blood caused by a self-inflicted shotgun wound under the chin. I'll save you from the description. There was just something about that gut feeling while traveling this abandoned and quiet mountain road, followed by a sense of being tricked by the gut feeling, then finding out it was true by discovering such a gruesome scene, having to wait 3 hours next to his truck waiting for body removal, and then to end it all by having to go to the family who was expecting good news to deliver to them the worst news possible. That makes me feel creeped out to this day. I responded to a report of an unresponsive infant. When I arrived, all the family members were standing around casually in the front yard pointing into the house. I found the baby in the back room laying on her back on a bare mattress. I started CPR, but realized the baby was probably already deceased. We rushed her out to the arriving ambulance hoping they had a way to bring her back. I learned she was the mother's second suspicious SIDS death, and I had her other children removed from her care. The difficult part was when I left the scene and went to the ER to see what came of the situation. As I walked in and asked where she was, an ER nurse walked over to me and handed me the deceased baby swaddled in a blanket and told me to wait for someone to show me to the morgue. So I'm standing there in the ER in uniform holding what everyone thinks is a live infant, but rather, an infant corpse, and several people stop by wanting to see her and commenting on how cute it is to see an officer holding a baby. I just smiled, but it killed me inside. I was ushered back to the morgue after what felt like an eternity, and told I had to wait with the baby until the medical examiner arrived. They took the blankets off and laid her on a stainless steel gurney and left me alone with her again. I lounged around the morgue for about an hour waiting. By the time I got home several hours after the end of my shift, because this call came out 15 minutes before the end of my 10-hour shift, I laid down on my bed and cried for a long time. My young daughter was in daycare, and my wife at work. I really needed to hold both of them, so the house felt incredibly empty. My daughter was only slightly older than the infant, and when I was looking at her earlier, I kept seeing my own daughter. I didn't get any sleep at all before going back in for the next shift later that night. One night at about 1130, this guy jumps off of a bridge into a bay. On the way down, he hits a guardrail and loses both forearms and the top of his head. One set of officers found his arms and set them aside. I was on the dive team, so we go collect his remains. While we check on his condition, we notice the brain is missing. This was me flipping up his scalp and taking a peek inside to find nothing there. It's very strange to look for something very important and not find it. Anyway, we bag him up and get him on the boat. Our supervisor tells us we have to at least look for his brains. Gross. So we dive and look around, but the only thing we find is a piece of skull. And we had decided if we did find it, none of us wanted to grab it. My dad worked in a precinct with one of highest crime rates in NYC. I think it had the highest murder rate during his years on the job. Anyway, he won't tell us stories about what he's seen because they're mostly horrific and still give him nightmares almost 15 years off the job. However, I do remember he told us one story when he was really drunk. A woman in her 20s walked into her apartment building late from work one night and was waiting for the elevator. It opened, and the only person in there was a creepy-looking guy. Though apprehensive, she got in and pressed her floor number, but noticed that the basement button was pressed. Normally after 9 p.m. maintenance would lock the basement button to prevent random people from going down there and fucking with shit. I guess someone forgot to lock it. The creepy guy ended up taking her down there, tying her up, and raping and torturing her for hours. He then took her apartment key, went up to the floor she'd pressed when she'd first gotten into the elevator, tried every door until he found hers, and took her roommate, also a woman in her 20s, into the basement where he continued torturing and raping both of them until dawn. Maintenance found them that morning, and my dad was a responder. Again, my dad never told us stories. This one might have stuck out because he has 4 daughters, but I think it's gotta be up there in creepy factor. 2 adults reported missing, parents of 2 adult children, 1 male, 1 female. Alerts are in place for the missing people's credit cards. The father's credit card hits on a purchase at a jewelry store where an engagement ring was purchased. It leads us to the son who made the purchase of the ring. Son is questioned and confessed to killing both parents and burying them in shallow graves. The son led us to the gravesite and we began the process of recovery. Both mom and dad had black garbage bags over their heads being held in place by duct tape around their necks. The sight of the bodies, especially their faces once the bags were removed and the smell is something I'll never forget. My father has been an officer for 20 plus years and this story is probably the worst thing he has ever had to do. My father and I were heading to the range one day to sight in our hunting rifles. We were in his police vehicle since we were going to the shooting range for local law enforcement personnel. Dispatch came over the radio to get an officer out to a 911 call of a possible dead body. Many of the officers joked over the radio that it was probably a prank or someone overreacting since it was around Halloween. The responding officer arrives at the scene and calls in that he is going into the woods to investigate. A few minutes later he sends out a call confirming it's an actual dead body and to get the necessary resources sent out to assist. Then the responding officer personally calls my father because he recognized the body. It was my dad's brother. He had been having rough times and decided to end it by hanging himself from a tree 50 yards into the woods next to railroad tracks. The second worst part was that he had been reported missing for a few months. So by the time they found his body he was severely rotted. The worst part was that my father had to go to assist in the removal and scene investigation. That day was the first time I ever saw my father cry and I was in my mid-teens. My department sends an officer to all rescue calls if one is available. We got a call late one night to assist rescue at a townhouse complex for a woman hemorrhaging. We didn't show up until rescue had already left with the patient. So we let ourselves into the residence and eventually found the bathroom, which was covered in blood. Blood on the walls, all over the toilet, everywhere. Crazy amount of blood. Rescue hadn't mentioned anything suspicious on the radio, so this was surprising. We were preparing to leave when one of the younger officers noticed bloody footprints leading to the front door, and then across the parking lot, to a dumpster. We gathered at the dumpster, lifted up the top, and lit up the interior with our flashlights. Same officer extended his baton, reached into the dumpster with it, and brought out a bloody plastic grocery bag, with a dead baby in it. True story. My cousin is a cop and he responded to a call on Valentine's Day night. A 12-year-old girl called in to say her mother had blown her brains out in the living room. I guess her and her brother were getting ready for dinner and the mom just shot herself. He said the creepy thing about it was dinner all set up, drinks on the table and suddenly she shot herself. Kids were sitting outside when he arrived. To this day I can't imagine Valentine's Day for them. But I know that is something that stuck with him, seeing that detention officer at a local jail here. We had a guy get brought in about 2 AM one night who we immediately knew was about to give us a fun time based on the way he was moving, quickly snapping the head back and forth, looking all over the room, etc. One of my co-workers and I stay with the booking officer to help her out when the shit inevitably hits the fan. The guy keeps rambling on throughout the whole process. Parts of his speech are understandable but most of it is gibberish. At one point he looks up at my co-worker and says, "Would you blame me for it?" Trying to keep the guy calm, my co-worker tells him, "Nah, man, no one can blame you." For whatever reason this set the guy off. He leaps off the bench and we both push him back down. My co-worker is trying to get handcuffs on his other wrist. He was already handcuffed by one hand to the bench, and I'm holding him against the wall with every bit of strength I have. This motherfucker was strong. I swear the bench was about to come up off the concrete when he first leapt at us. Once my co-worker gets handcuffs on him, we take a step back. The guy throws his head back, eyes rolled all the way back, and lets out an inhuman scream that I've only heard in movies about demon possession. He then moves his head as if he's looking around the room, but still with his eyes rolled into the back of his head and spouts off more nonsense. I'm not Catholic but I was very tempted to cross myself. The screaming, head throwing back and eye rolling continue on for about 45 minutes. Every so often he'd come back to reality and talk to us like a normal person for a moment and then go back into crazy mode. I was a parks officer for a downtown metropolitan out in the Pacific Northwest. I saw my fair share of weird stuff on my 1700-0100 shift. Naked bike ride after party at midnight with about 1,000 or so naked people chilling out, the occasional couple having sex, homeless person masturbating or shooting up heroin and the occasional dead body were all a normal part of the job. Anyways, this one night we were sent to investigate a tent set up relatively near the waterfront, which was generally a homeless person that was trying to stay dry for the night. So we get there around 2330 and tell the lady inside that she has to go a few hundred yards away to an area that isn't patrolled. She fusses and bitches about having to move, then mentioned a man living in a cave at the bottom of a shallow ravine nearby that's been killing small animals and eating them. We ask her for more information and she points to a general area about 50 yards away through some thick brush, the general area most people wouldn't wander past. My partner and I start to walk through the thick brush with just our flashlights and eventually stumble upon the ravine, and sure enough there is a small opening on the side enough for a person to fit in. I scale down about 20 feet and peek inside the opening and see what seems like a massive pile of magazines, torn pages, articles of clothing, a sugar cookie tin, a gorilla costume hand, some crude looking tools including a makeshift bow, a few knives and other generally weird shit. Being curious, and that the cave was empty, I opened the sugar cookie tin and found a large amount of what seemed like raw animal meat. At this point I was thoroughly freaked the fuck out and decided to unass the area and inform the police of what I had found. We didn't carry weapons. We never found out what came of the guy who was staying there or what was going on there. But definitely freaky at around midnight in pitch black conditions. It was a stormy night on the Oregon coast. A lady was driving drunk and ran into the back of a parked school bus. When she did, her car caught on fire, but she was able to escape. When I found her slowly walking down a side street, I was telling her to stop and turn around. When she turned around, her lower jaw was gone, and she was totally dazed. Her tongue was sticking straight out the top of her neck, and she was trying to talk. She ended up surviving but needed tons of plastic surgery. Military police officer, so I worked both law enforcement and corrections for a bit. In corrections the main office was also the police services desk. Often it would ring and no one would be at the other end. Anyways, one time it rang and instead of a number it had a descriptor that I don't remember exactly. Something like emergency phone 11. I was new and immediately called my superiors about it. They told me to drop it and never report anything like that again. Ominous, right? Anyways, the reason I told that is to tell this. Sometime later, on patrol I got dispatched to essentially an abandoned side of the base to respond to an emergency phone call. No location at first because radio didn't know where emergency phone 11 was and was new to the base, so he didn't get the same memo to not report those calls. Radio then went on to say that the caller had sounded frantic and thought they were being chased, meaning that someone had actually been on the other end. Radio eventually digs up some old maps that label emergency radio 11 location and relays them to me and my partner, so we drive there in a hurry. There is no phone, just a broken pole where one had once been. That was a fun one to report. Ex-cop. I worked in a high-tech task force agency conducting computer forensics investigations. Lots of child porn. Lots. Anyways, we were doing a multi-agency search warrant sweep in large metro area in California. We serve a search warrant for distributing/possessing CP at a residence in a semi-decent area, and the suspect fit the prototypical Hollywood child molester look. He lived with his disabled wife, no kids, and she had mobility issues, mostly stayed downstairs, and had not been upstairs for years. We go upstairs, and this guy has a legitimate masturbation station set up in one of the bedrooms that had an outside padlock on it. It was dark, the windows were covered, and he had baby dolls with their assholes cut out all over the room and some of their mouths cut out for impromptu baby sex doll. Some of the heads were removed and scattered on the floor. This guy had serious issues. Edit, missing words. Man, this was probably 2010. 2011. I was really new. Call came as an unknown problem. Basically the 911 was so fucked up, even dispatch didn't know what to call it. Turned it this guy had just murdered his stepfather and then walked to his grandparents' house to kill them as well. He stabbed his grandmother through the eye with a Rambo-style Bowie knife, one that had the compass in the pommel of the handle. He missed her brain by about 1/8 of an inch, so she did not die. Instead she came running out of the house when we got there, knife sticking out of her fucking eye, and the compass was spinning around because she was moving. My brain literally went, "That's not real," and I went past her, along with several other cops, before the sergeant was like, "What in the actual fuck are you guys doing?" She survived. We caught the guy in a stroke of pure luck. Elderly woman with a massive hunting knife for an eye, definitely the creepiest thing I can remember seeing. Working third shift on Halloween night, I'm out by one of our smaller lakes just outside the city limits. Kids love to go out and drink, which is surrounded by some very nice houses. Going through the neighborhood, each of the roads ends at a small 2-lane road that surrounds the lake. I'm slowing to the stop sign and already starting to look to my right to make the turn when my headlights start tracing the rock wall that surrounds the lake. I catch something out of the corner of my eye in one of the large trees that dots the walk path. I back up to see what it was and I see a guy hanging. At first I thought it was a Halloween decoration. The neighborhood is really into decorating for every holiday, so I stop, get out, and as soon as my flashlight hits him I realize, nope, no decoration, he dead. As I'm standing there getting ready to call it in, I notice a gaggle of kids coming down the street trick-or-treating. Shit, as soon as they see my car they start heading my way faster, so I book it back up the block to meet the parent walking with them and tell her she needs to take the long way around the block the other way. She can see it on my face, I'm not kidding. Turns out he was a 20-year-old that was devastated about his girlfriend breaking up with him, and she lived in the last house on that block where she would see him the next morning when she looked out her window.